Welcome to Only True Stories channel that we hope you will have fun with us. Enjoy watching. A husband kicks his wife and children out of the house, forcing them to return to her late parents' home, where they discover something shocking. Dear viewers, welcome to our channel. Subscribe to receive more stories every day. The house that had once been a home was no longer hers. Freya Carter stood outside the towering brick mansion with her children Luna and Jacob, clutching their few remaining belongings. The sun had just dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows over the manicured lawn, and the sky glowed in the soft hues of dusk. It was a picture-perfect setting, but Freya's heart was far from at peace. Just days ago, her husband Alexander had handed her divorce papers with a cold, indifferent look in his eyes. He didn't yell or accuse her of anything. He simply said it was over 16 years of marriage dissolved. In a few words, Alexander's affair was no secret. His new, much younger girlfriend wasn't even hidden. Their friends, who had pretended not to notice for months, could no longer mask their discomfort at social gatherings. But Freya had always believed that Alexander would eventually come to his senses. She was wrong. "I think it's time you moved out," Freya and Alexander had said in that condescending tone he used whenever he dismissed her as an inconvenience. "The house is mine. You can take whatever fits in your car." It wasn't just the physical house that was lost. Alexander had stripped her of everything: her financial security, her identity as a wife, and, worst of all, her sense of self-worth. It had all been siphoned away, leaving her with nothing but the kids and the crushing reality that she had nowhere to go. Luna, now 16 and starting to adopt her father's cold indifference, sighed heavily as they loaded the car. "Where are we even going?" she asked, arms crossed over her chest. Her attitude had worsened since the split, as if Alexander's dismissal of Fran had trickled down to her as well. Jacob, just 10 years old, was quiet and still trying to grasp what was happening. He clutched his worn-out teddy bear to his chest, glancing up at his mother with wide, questioning eyes. "Mom, when can we come back?" Freya knelt down and placed a hand on his shoulder. "I don't know, baby, but we'll figure it out." She smiled. Though the effort felt futile, her voice cracked as she tried to be strong for them, but inside she was broken. With a few bags packed into her old sedan, she started the engine. The mansion, now lit up by the exterior lights, faded into the background as they pulled out of the driveway. Freya kept her focus on the road, trying not to let the tears spill over. The only place left for her to go was her childhood home in Willow Creek, a small, forgotten town tucked away in the countryside. The house had been empty since her father's death several years ago. She hadn't been back since the funeral, but now it was her only refuge. The drive to Willow Creek took over 5 hours. The city lights gave way to quiet, dark roads winding through the countryside. Freya's mind wandered back to her youth, to the summer spent in the old house with her father. He had been a man of modest means, always working hard to make ends meet. She had never imagined that his house would one day become her last option when they finally arrived. The house loomed in front of them like a relic from a bygone era. The shutters were falling off, the paint chipped and peeling, and the garden had long been overtaken by weeds. It was a stark contrast to the pristine mansion she had just left behind. Luna wrinkled her nose. "We're staying here just for a little while," Freya replied, though she wasn't sure how long a little while would be. She unlocked the door and a musty, stale smell filled the air as they stepped inside. Dust covered the wooden floors and cobwebs adorned the corners of the ceiling. The furniture was old, just as her father had left it. The weight of the situation pressed down on her chest, but she pushed through, knowing her kids needed her to be strong. "We'll clean it up," Freya said, forcing a smile. "It'll feel like home soon." The days that followed were a blur of adjustment. Freya spent every waking moment cleaning the house, trying to make it livable for the kids. She took on odd jobs around town, from cleaning houses to working at the local grocery store. It wasn't much, but it was all she could find in Willow Creek. Her savings from the divorce settlement were dwindling fast, and the thought of not being able to provide for her children kept her awake at night. Luna's resentment grew as the weeks passed. She was used to private schools, shopping trips, and a life of luxury, all of which had been ripped away. Now she had to share a bedroom with her brother in a small, dilapidated house. Fran could feel the anger and bitterness festering in her daughter, but there was nothing she could do to fix it. Jacob, on the other hand, adjusted better. He found joy in the simple things, helping his mom around the house, exploring the woods behind their property, and even befriending some of the local kids. His innocence and resilience were the only things keeping Fran grounded, but as the months wore on, the financial strain became unbearable. Fran's odd jobs weren't enough to cover the bills, and she had already pawned off most of the valuable items Alexander had left her with. There were days she skipped meals so the kids could eat, and every night she lay awake, wondering how long they could last. One evening after putting Jacob to bed, Fran sat at the kitchen table with a pile of unpaid bills in front of her. She buried her face in her hands, tears slipping through her fingers. She felt trapped, helpless, and utterly alone. It was in that moment of despair that she decided to start going through the old items left behind in the house. Maybe she could sell some of her father's belongings. Even if they didn't seem valuable, she had to do something. The attic was the last place Fran expected to find anything of worth. It was cluttered with old furniture, dusty boxes, and broken trinkets from decades past. But she needed money, and desperation had driven her to search every corner of the house. After hours of sorting through junk, her eyes landed on an old weathered trunk in the corner. Half covered by a moth-eaten blanket, she recognized it immediately. Her father used to keep the trunk in his bedroom, but he had always been secretive about its contents. He had told her once some things are better left buried at the time. She didn't question it. Curiosity piqued. Fran dragged the trunk into the center of the attic and pried it open. Inside were stacks of documents yellowed with age and a few personal keepsakes. First it seemed like nothing of importance: letters, old photos, bills, just remnants of her father's life. But then she found an envelope thick and sealed with wax. The initials E.C. were scrawled on the front in her grandmother's handwriting. Eleanor Carter. Fran's heart skipped a beat. Her grandmother had died when Fran was a teenager, and she hadn't thought of her in years. What could this be? She opened the envelope carefully and unfolded the letter inside. Her eyes scanned the words disbelief, washing over her as she read. The letter was from a law firm dated over 40 years ago. It detailed how her grandmother Eleanor had made a substantial investment in a small oil company during the Great Depression. That company, according to the letter, had merged with a much larger corporation, Magnus Petroleum, one of the most successful oil companies in the world. And then came the kicker. Eleanor's shares in the company had grown exponentially in value, worth millions. The letter instructed her father to claim the inheritance, but as far as Fran knew, he never had Fran's mind raced. Could this be real? Could she, a woman who had just been left destitute by her ex-husband, actually be sitting on a fortune? 5 hours? Fran stared at the letter, her thoughts spinning. How could this have been kept a secret for so long? Why hadn't her father ever claimed the shares? Had he known? Had he just ignored it? The questions were endless, but one thing was clear. If this letter was legitimate, she was sitting on an inheritance worth millions. She immediately called the law firm mentioned in the letter, only to discover it no longer existed. But after some research, she found out that the firm had merged with a larger legal entity, and there was still a possibility that her claim could be filed. With renewed hope, Fran scheduled a meeting with a lawyer in the city. This was it. This was her chance to pull herself and her children out of the pit of financial ruin. Abigail examined the documents carefully, her brow furrowing as she read through the faded letter and the accompanying legal papers. "This is unusual," she said, glancing up at Fran. "If these documents are legitimate, you could indeed be entitled to a significant amount of money. But we're talking about a major corporation here. Magnus Petroleum, they won't just hand over millions without a fight." Fran nodded, anxiety gnawing at her insides. "I understand, but do I have a real shot?" Abigail leaned back in her chair, tapping the end of her pen. Thoughtfully, "It's going to be a long process. We'll need to verify the legitimacy of the documents, track down any relevant paperwork, and, most importantly, establish that your grandmother's shares weren't claimed by anyone else if your father never claimed them, and the shares have been sitting untouched for decades. Then you're the rightful heir. Fran's heart fluttered with a mix of excitement and fear. What happens if someone else tries to claim them? We'll cross that bridge when we get there, Abigail replied calmly. But for now we need to focus on gathering as much evidence as possible. We'll start by contacting Magnus Petroleum's legal team and filing a formal claim. Fran left the law firm feeling a cautious sense of hope. It was the first time in months that she didn't feel completely helpless. The idea that she could actually be sitting on a fortune seemed too good to be true, but Abigail's confidence reassured her. However, little did Fran know her problems were just beginning. The initial excitement of discovering the potential inheritance began to wear off as the legal process dragged on. Weeks turned into months as Abigail and her team painstakingly gathered documents, corresponded with Magnus Petroleum's legal department, and worked to verify Fran's claim. Every day felt like an eternity as Fran waited for news. Any news that would confirm the legitimacy of the shares. During this time, Fran's financial situation worsened. Despite her best efforts to make ends meet, the bills were piling up and her odd jobs in Willow Creek were barely covering the basics. The house, which had once provided a semblance of comfort, was now a constant reminder of her struggles. One evening, as Fran sat at the kitchen table sorting through yet another stack of unpaid bills, the phone rang. She picked it up, expecting it to be Abigail, with an update on the case. Instead, a familiar voice echoed through the line. "Hello." Megan Alexander's voice was calm, almost smug. Fran's heart sank. "Alexander, why are you calling me?" "I heard about your little inheritance," he said, his tone laced with sarcasm. "Magnus Petroleum, right? Quite the windfall." If it's true, Fran's stomach twisted. How did he know she hadn't told anyone about the inheritance, not even the kids?
"How do you know about that?"
she asked, trying to keep her voice steady.
"Oh,
"I have my ways," Alexander replied nonchalantly. "Let's just say I have some friends in high places. I thought you might need some legal advice." Freya's blood boiled. Of course Alexander had found out. He always had his ear to the ground when it came to anything that could benefit him financially. "I don't need your help," she spat. "Stay out of my business," Alexander chuckled. "You see, Freya, that's where you're wrong. You may think you're sitting on a fortune, but there's more to this than you realize. Those shares, they belong to our kids. Legally, half of anything you inherit is theirs." Megan's grip tightened on the phone.
what are you talking about?
"You'll see soon enough," Alexander said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "I've already contacted my lawyer. We're filing a claim on behalf of Luna and Jacob. It's only fair, don't you think?" Before Fran could respond, the line went dead. She stood frozen, the phone still pressed to her ear, her mind racing. Alexander was going to try and take the inheritance course.
He was.
He had already taken everything else. Why wouldn't he try to take this too? The next few weeks were a blur of legal meetings and sleepless nights. Alexander, true to his word, had filed a claim on behalf of their children, arguing that they were entitled to a portion of the inheritance. His legal team, armed with every dirty trick in the book, was prepared to drag Freya through a lengthy and expensive court battle. Abigail worked tirelessly to defend Fran's claim, but the fight was taking a toll. Every time Fran thought she was making progress, Alexander's lawyers would throw another obstacle in her way. They questioned the legitimacy of the documents, argued that Fran's father had no right to the shares, and even went as far as to accuse Fran of trying to defraud the company. But the worst blow came when Luna, her own daughter, sided with Alexander. "I don't understand why you're fighting this, Mom," Luna said. One evening, her arms crossed as she stood in the doorway of Fran's bedroom. "Dad's just trying to make sure Jacob and I get what we deserve." Freya looked up from the pile of papers she had been reviewing, her heart breaking at the sight of her daughter's cold expression. "Luna, this inheritance, it's not about your father. It's about our future, your future exactly." Luna snapped, "And we deserve our share,"
Dad said.
"You're being selfish, trying to keep it all for yourself." Freya's chest tightened. She had seen this coming for months, Alexander's manipulation, his constant undermining of her authority. And now he had turned Luna against her. "I'm not keeping it for myself," Fran said, her voice shaking. "I'm trying to secure a future for all of us. Your father. He's only doing this because he wants control." Luna rolled her eyes. "You're just mad because Dad's better at this than you are. Maybe if you hadn't been so dependent on him all those years, you'd actually know how to handle yourself." Fran's hands clenched into fists. The anger and frustration she had been bottling up for months finally boiled over. "I wasn't dependent on him, Luna. I was raising you and Jacob while he was off making his millions. I sacrificed everything for this family, and now he's trying to take away the one thing that could save us." Luna's face hardened, and without another word, she turned and walked out of the room, slamming the door behind her. Fran collapsed onto the bed, tears streaming down her face. She had lost so much already, her marriage, her home, her dignity, and now it felt like she was losing her children too. The courtroom was cold and sterile, the air thick with tension. As the judge took a seat, Freya sat at the plaintiff's table, her heart pounding in her chest across from her. Alexander sat with his legal team, a smug smile on his face. Luna sat beside him, her expression unreadable. Abigail leaned over and whispered, "Stay calm. We've got this." Freya nodded, though her nerves were frayed. This was it, the final showdown. After months of legal battles, depositions, and countless sleepless nights, it all came down to this moment. The judge would decide whether the shares rightfully belonged to Fran or if Alexander would succeed in taking them from her. As the proceedings began, Alexander's lawyer wasted no time in attacking Fran's character. He painted her as a vindictive ex-wife desperate to keep the money for herself out of spite. He argued that the shares were rightfully the property of Lily and Jacob and that Alexander, as their father, was acting in their best interests. Fran sat silently, her hands trembling as she listened to the lies being spun about her. She wanted to scream to defend herself, but she knew better than to let her emotions get the best of her. When it was Abigail's turn to speak, she did so with calm authority. She presented the documents Fran had found in the attic, outlining the chain of ownership that traced back to Eleanor Carter. She argued that Freya, as Eleanor's only living heir, was entitled to the shares and that Alexander's claim was nothing more than a greedy attempt to take control of the inheritance. But then Abigail dropped the bombshell that would change everything. "We have evidence." Abigail said, her voice steady, that Alexander Carter was aware of the existence of these shares. Long before this claim was filed, the courtroom fell silent. Abigail continued, "During the course of our investigation, we discovered that Mr. Carter had in fact come across these same documents shortly after Fran's father passed away. He chose not to pursue the shares at that time because he believed there would be legal complications. However, he has been aware of their existence for years." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Is this true, Mr. Carter?" Alexander's smug expression faltered for the first time. He stammered, I didn't think it was relevant." Abigail pressed on, "Your Honor, this demonstrates that Mr. Carter's actions are not in the best interest of his children. He is attempting to claim these shares for his own financial gain, not for the benefit of his family." The judge's decision came swiftly. Fran was awarded full control of the shares, with Alexander's claim dismissed as an attempt to manipulate the legal system for his own benefit. It was a victory Fran had fought long and hard for, but it was bittersweet. Luna, furious at the outcome, refused to speak to her mother for weeks. Alexander, humiliated by the public exposure of his greed, disappeared from their lives, leaving Fran to pick up the pieces. But slowly Fran began to rebuild. She used the money from the shares to secure a stable future for herself and her children. She invested wisely, making sure that Jacob and Luna would never have to struggle the way she had. And though it took time, Fran eventually found peace. The inheritance had been a blessing, but the real victory was reclaiming her life and her independence. She had fought against betrayal, greed, and manipulation, and she had won. In the end, Fran realized that the wealth her grandmother had left behind was not just about money. It was about the strength and resilience she had discovered within herself and that she knew was the greatest inheritance of all. Dear viewers, dear friends, thank you very much for watching. Leave comments, put like, share with friends, and subscribe to the channel.